The Grand Hall of the Galactic Coalition stretched for nearly a mile in every direction, and the ceiling rose so high that clouds actually formed near the top on humid days. Commander Zethral of the Veluxy Hegemony stood at the central platform and looked out at the gathered delegates from 47 different spacefaring species, and he felt a familiar sense of pride swelling in his four hearts. His species had studied warfare for 12,000 years, and they had turned it from chaos into pure mathematics, and every battle could be predicted, and every outcome could be calculated before the first shot was ever fired. Today, the topic of discussion was whether or not humanity should be allowed to join the coalition military forces. And Zethral had prepared a presentation that would settle the matter once and for all. He raised two of his forearms, and the holographic displays flickered to life around him, showing images of human soldiers and their primitive weapons. Fellow delegates, he began in a voice that carried across the massive chamber. We gather here today to discuss the matter of human integration into our defense forces, and I must tell you that the answer is quite simple. He gestured toward the displays, and they showed footage of human wars from throughout their history, and the assembled aliens watched with a mixture of curiosity and disgust. Humans have been fighting each other since they first learned to walk upright, and in all that time they have failed to advance beyond the most basic forms of combat technology. Scattered clicks and hums of agreement rippled through the chamber, and Zethral allowed himself a small smile. They still use chemical propellant weapons, he continued, which means they are shooting small pieces of metal at each other using tiny explosions, and this is the same basic technology they developed hundreds of years ago. More sounds of amusement came from the delegates, and several of them turned to look at the human delegation, which consisted of only two people. Ambassador Chen Wei sat rigid in his seat, with his hands folded and his expression carefully neutral, and beside him sat a woman in a worn leather jacket who looked like she would rather be anywhere else in the galaxy. Her name was Lieutenant Commander Maya Vasquez, and she had been sent to the symposium as punishment for an incident on Theta Station that had involved a bar fight and 3 broken tables and one very angry Krethax merchant. Ambassador Chun had told her to sit quietly and represent humanity with dignity, and she had promised to try her best. But as she listened to the alien commander mock her species and their weapons, she found that trying her best was getting harder by the minute. Zethral was still talking, and his forearms were waving dramatically as he made his points. Combat, he declared, has been solved by the advanced species of this galaxy, and we have turned it into a science that can be measured and predicted and optimized. He pulled up a complex mathematical formula on the display, and Maya had no idea what any of it meant. The Cathorn curve demonstrates that energy expenditure in combat follows a predictable pattern, and the optimal engagement distance correlates directly to weapon yield, and a warrior's effectiveness scales in a linear fashion. With technological advancement, he paused for effect and then pointed one long finger toward the human delegation. By every metric we use to assess combat potential, he said slowly, humans are negligible. Maya's hand drifted down to rest on the revolver at her hip, and it was a Colt single-action army that had been manufactured over 200 years ago, and it had belonged to her grandmother before it was passed down to her. On her other hip hung its twin, and this one had been her grandfather's gun, and together the pair had been through more history than most of the aliens in this room could imagine. Ambassador Chun noticed her movement, and he leaned over to whisper urgently in her ear. Lieutenant Commander, he said in a tone that was trying very hard to be calm, please remember that we are here as observers only, and any incident would set back human diplomatic efforts by decades. Maya did not respond, but she did take her hand away from the revolver, and she crossed her arms over her chest. Instead, Zethral had moved on to discussing the specific weaknesses of human physiology, and he seemed to be enjoying himself immensely. They have no natural armor, he said, "and their skin can be pierced by almost anything sharp, and they cannot regenerate limbs or heal from wounds that would be minor inconveniences to most species." A delegate from the Morphean Collective raised a tentacle and asked, "What about their neural processing capabilities and their reaction times?" Zethral made a dismissive gesture with all four arms at once. "Adequate for hunting small animals on their home planet," he replied, "but completely insufficient for modern galactic combat, where engagements occur at speeds that their brains simply cannot process." Maya thought about her grandmother, who had killed a man in the dark when she was only 16 years old, and she thought about her grandfather, who had fought in 3 wars and walked away from each one, and she thought about all the humans throughout history who had been told they could not win and had won anyway. But she stayed quiet because she had promised to try. The presentation continued for another hour, and Zethral covered every aspect of human military capability with the same contemptuous tone, and by the time he was finished, the assembled delegates seemed thoroughly convinced that humans had nothing to offer. In conclusion, Zethral said, "The Coalition should deny humanity's request for military integration, and we should instead focus on more productive partnerships, such as cultural exchange or agricultural cooperation." He paused and looked directly at Maya with what might have been pity in his alien eyes. "Humans are simply not built for war," he said, "and it would be cruel to send them into battles they cannot hope to survive." Maya met his gaze, and she did not blink, and she did not look away. Ambassador Chen was gathering his materials and preparing to leave with whatever dignity he could salvage, and he touched Maya's arm to signal that they should go. But before they could stand, a voice rang out from the other side of the chamber, and it belonged to a massive insectoid creature whose exoskeleton gleamed under the lights. "I have a proposal," the creature said, "that might make this discussion more interesting." And Maya Vasquez smiled for the first time since the symposium had begun. The insectoid creature who had spoken was named Chervex, and he was a warrior of the Krethax species, and his kind were considered to be among the most dangerous fighters in the entire galaxy. He stood nearly 8 feet tall, and his body was covered in plates of natural armor that could stop most projectile weapons, and his 4 arms ended in claws that could tear through metal like paper. But his most dangerous feature was the bioelectric organs clustered in his chest, and these organs could discharge enough electricity to kill a human from 50 meters away. Cherv moved forward through the crowd of delegates, and his multiple legs carried him with a grace that seemed impossible for something so large, and every step he took made a clicking sound on the polished floor. "Commander Zethral has given us many numbers and theories," Chervex said in a voice that buzzed and clicked through his translator, "but I think we would all learn more from a simple demonstration." The chamber fell silent, and hundreds of alien eyes turned to look at the Krethax warrior, and then at the 2 humans in the observation section. Ambassador Chun was already on his feet, and his face had gone pale. "This is highly irregular," he said quickly, "and the human delegation did not come here to participate in any kind of combat exercise." Chervex turned his compound eyes toward the ambassador, and something that might have been amusement flickered across his alien features. "I am not challenging the diplomat," he said. "I am challenging the soldier who sits beside him, and I can smell the weapon she carries, and I can see the way she holds herself like a predator waiting to strike." Every delegate in the chamber turned to look at Maya, and she felt hundreds of different types of eyes studying her and assessing her, and most of them had already decided she was not worth their attention. She stood up slowly, and Ambassador Chan grabbed her arm. "Lieutenant Commander," he hissed, "I am ordering you to decline, and we cannot afford an international incident at this level." Maya looked at him, and then she looked at Chervex, and then she looked at Commander Zethral, who was watching with obvious interest. "Ambassador," she said quietly, "they just spent an hour telling the entire galaxy that humans are worthless, and if I walk away now, then every species here will believe it forever. And if you fight and lose, then they will have proof." Chun replied. Maya smiled. And it was not a pleasant smile. Then I better not lose. She pulled her arm free from the ambassador's grip, and she walked down from the observation section and onto the main floor of the chamber, and every step she took echoed in the sudden silence. Jerv watched her approach, and his mandibles spread in what his species used as a smile. "The human accepts," he announced to the chamber, "and I propose we use the training protocols so that no one needs to die today, unless, of course, the human would prefer live combat." Maya stopped about 20 meters away from the massive insectoid, and she tilted her head to one side as if considering his offer. "Training rounds are fine," she said, "but I have conditions." A ripple of surprise went through the chamber, and Commander Zethril leaned forward in his seat with renewed interest. "The prey has conditions." Chervex clicked. How amusing, and what would these conditions be? "No simulation chambers," Maya said. "I want real physics and real movement in a real space, and I want your people and my people to see exactly what happens without any computer getting in the way." Chervex spread all four of his arms wide in a gesture of acceptance. "Agreed," he said. "And what else?" "Pain receptors enabled," Maya continued. "If I hit you, then you feel it, and if you hit me, then I feel it, and we both walk away with a clear understanding of what happened here today." More surprise rippled through the delegates, and several of them began pulling up data on their personal devices to record what was about to happen. Commander Zethril raised two of his arms to get attention. "I feel I should inform the human," he said in a tone that was almost kind. "The Kreth-Axe bioelectric discharges cause immediate paralysis even in training mode, and that Chervex is faster than any unaugmented human by a factor of at least 3. Maya did not look at him, and she kept her eyes fixed on Chervex. "I appreciate the information," she said. "Do you understand what it means?" Zethril pressed. "And do you understand that our combat models give you a survival probability of only 3%? Now Maya did turn to look at him, and something in her eyes made the Veluxi commander shift uncomfortably in his seat. "Your models," she said slowly, "are about to learn something new." She turned back to face Chervex, and the massive warrior was studying her with an intensity that suggested he was finally taking her seriously. "You carry 2 of those primitive weapons," he observed. "And I am curious why a human would bring such ancient tools to a gathering of advanced species." Maya's hands moved to rest on the grips of her revolvers, and the worn leather felt warm and familiar under her fingers. "These belong to my grandparents," she said, "and they have a lot of history. History will not help you here," Chervex replied. "And when this is over, you will understand why the Kreth-Axe have been feared across the galaxy for 10,000 years. When this is over," Maya said, "you will understand why humans are still alive." The chamber was completely silent now, and even the delegates who had been dismissive before were paying close attention, because something in the human's voice suggested that this was not going to go the way anyone expected. Ambassador Chun had sunk back into his seat, and he was watching through his fingers like a man who could not look away from a disaster commander. Zethril was already preparing his analysis systems because this would be valuable data regardless of the outcome, and Maya Vasquez was thinking about her grandmother and her grandfather and every human who had ever faced something bigger and stronger and faster and meaner and had refused to back down. The signal officer for the symposium moved to the central platform and raised the traditional flag that would start the exhibition. "Combatants ready." The officer announced. Jairv dropped into his combat stance, and his bioelectric organs began to glow with building charge, and his claws extended to their full length. Maya took a breath and let it out slowly, and she did not draw her weapons. Yet the flag dropped, and everything that the Galactic Coalition thought they knew about combat was about to change forever. The moment before the flag dropped, was the longest moment of Maya's life, and she could feel every heartbeat and every breath and every tiny movement of air against her skin. Chervex was glowing now, and the bioelectric organs in his chest were fully charged and ready to fire, and his compound eyes were locked onto her with the focus of a predator about to strike. Around them, the delegates leaned forward in their seats, and recording devices of every kind were pointed at the combat floor. And the Coalition's best tactical analysts were running predictive models on their displays. Commander Zethral's voice cut through the silence one last time. "For the record," he announced, "Coalition combat theory predicts this engagement will last approximately 6 seconds and will end with the human incapacitated by bioelectric discharge." Maya heard him, but she did not react, and her entire world had narrowed down to the creature in front of her, and the distance between them, and the weight of the revolvers on her hips. The flag dropped. Chervex moved. The Krethax warrior exploded forward with a speed that made several delegates gasp, and his 8 legs drove him across the floor like a missile, and his claws were already reaching for Maya's throat. According to Coalition combat theory, the human should have had time for maybe 1 shot before the insectoid closed the distance, and that shot would almost certainly miss because human reaction times were simply too slow to track a Krethax at full speed. But Maya did not try to track him. She did not aim at where he was. She aimed at where he was going to be. The revolvers came out of there, holsters in a motion so smooth and so fast that the recording devices would later have to slow down the footage just to see it happen, and both guns were firing before Chervex had covered half the distance. The first shot took him in the forward right leg joint, and it was the joint that bore most of his weight when running, and it was exactly where it needed to be to disrupt his momentum. The second shot hit his bioelectric organ cluster, and the training round delivered enough impact to scramble the delicate biological systems, and suddenly the charge that was building for his attack discharged harmlessly into his own body. Chervex stumbled, but he was a warrior with 10,000 years of genetic combat heritage, and he did not fall, and his other legs compensated, and his backup electrical organs began charging, and he was still coming. Maya was already moving. She did not run away from him like prey would run, and she did not stand still like a target waiting to be hit, and she did not do any of the things that Coalition combat theory said she should do. She ran toward him. Commander Zethral made a sound of confusion, and his tactical displays were flashing warnings that did not make sense because no rational combatant would close distance with a superior melee fighter. But Maya was not being rational. She was being human. The revolvers kept firing, and each shot found a joint or a nerve cluster or a critical system junction, and Maya was not aiming by looking down the sights of her guns, because there was no time for that, and instead she was aiming by instinct and by practice and by something deeper that lived in her bones. Chervex swung at her with all 4 arms, and each swing should have torn her apart, but she was not where his claws were going, and she was moving in ways that his combat training had never prepared him for. She ducked under one arm and slid past another and twisted around a third, and all the while her revolvers were speaking their ancient language of fire and lead. The Krethax warrior had never faced anything like this, and his species had been fighting for 10,000 years, and they had developed counters for every known combat style in the galaxy. But there was no counter for whatever this human was doing, because she was not following a style. She was not following any pattern that could be analyzed or predicted or countered. She was improvising. Maya fired her last round, and it hit Chervex in the nerve cluster at the base of his skull, and his entire body seized up, and he crashed to the floor with a sound like a building collapsing. She stood over him with both revolvers empty and smoking, and her chest was heaving, and her heart was pounding, but she was not hurt, and she had not taken a single hit. The chamber was silent. Commander Zethral was staring at his tactical display, and the numbers did not make sense, and the predictions had all been wrong, and his entire understanding of combat had just been shattered in less than 4 seconds. The delegates did not move, and they did not speak, and many of them were replaying the recording to make sure they had actually seen what they thought they had seen Ambassador Chun had. His mouth open and no sound was coming out. Maya looked down at Chervex, who was paralyzed by the training rounds, but still conscious, and his compound eyes were looking up at her with something that might have been respect. "Your combat theory," she said loudly enough for every translator in the room to pick up. "As a problem." Commander Zethral found his voice, and it came out rough and uncertain. "What problem?" he asked. Maya began reloading her revolvers, and the familiar motions of sliding rounds into cylinders helped calm her racing heart. "You calculated everything based on what makes sense," she said, "and you figured out the optimal distance for engagement, and the logical positioning for advantage, and the predictable pattern of escalation." She snapped both cylinders closed and holstered the weapons. "But humans do not fight to make sense," she continued, "and we do not fight because the odds are good, and we do not fight because our calculations tell us we will win." She looked up at the assembled delegates, and her eyes moved across hundreds of alien faces that were all watching her with new attention. "We fight because we have to," she said. "And we fight to survive, and we fight even when everything tells us we should lose, because somewhere in our history, we learned that the only way to stay alive was to never give up." She pointed at Commander Zethral's tactical display, which was still showing error messages. "Your models could not predict me because I was not optimizing," she said, "and I was not calculating, and I was not following any pattern that you could analyze." She paused and took a breath. "You have turned combat into mathematics," she said, "but we kept it as an art, and that is why you will never be able to predict what a human will do in a fight." The silence stretched on for a long moment, and then somewhere in the back of the chamber a delegate began to applaud, and soon others joined in, and the sound grew until it filled the entire massive space. Maya Vasquez stood alone on the combat floor, surrounded by the sound of hundreds of species, acknowledging something they had never expected to see. And Commander Zethral began to realize that everything he thought he knew about warfare was going to have to be rewritten from the beginning. The applause eventually died down, but the chaos that followed, it did not. And within minutes, the symposium hall had descended into something that looked very much like panic. 7 different species filed formal protests demanding that the exhibition be removed from the official record, and their representatives were shouting over each other in languages that the translators struggled to keep up with. 12 more delegations called for an immediate investigation into what they were calling possible human cheating through undetected technological augmentation, and they were already demanding that Maya submit to a full body scan. Krethak's delegation had gone completely silent, and they had gathered around their fallen warrior who was being treated by medical drones, and they were watching the replay of the fight over and over again, as if they could not believe what they were seeing. Commander Zethral had retreated to his private analysis station, and he was surrounded by holographic displays showing the combat from every possible angle, and none of the data made sense. His tactical models had predicted a 6-second engagement, ending with human defeat, and instead the fight had lasted less than 4 seconds and ended with the Krethak's warrior paralyzed on the floor. Human had fired 12 shots, and every single one had found a critical weak point, and she had done this while moving in ways that no combat algorithm could track or predict. It was impossible. And yet, had happened. Ambassador Chun had finally found Maya in a quiet corner of the chamber, where she was cleaning her revolvers with a small kit she kept in her jacket pocket. "Lieutenant Commander," he said, and his voice was a mixture of shock and something that might have been admiration. "What exactly did you just do?" Maya did not look up from her work, and she ran a soft cloth along the barrel of her grandmother's gun with practiced care. "I did what humans do," she said simply. "I survived." "You did more than survive," Chun replied. You made the entire Galactic Coalition question everything they thought they knew about warfare. Maya shrugged and moved on to cleaning her grandfather's revolver. They needed to learn, she said, and sometimes the only way to teach someone is to show them that they are wrong. Chun sat down heavily in the seat beside her, and he watched her work for a moment before speaking again. The Krethaks are demanding an explanation, he said. And Commander, Zethral wants to interview you about your combat methodology, and the Coalition Council is meeting an emergency session to discuss what they witnessed. Let them talk, Maya said, and let them analyze and let them run their numbers. Again and again until they understand. Understand what exactly? Maya finally looked up from her work, and her eyes met the ambassador's, and there was something old and fierce in her gaze. That humans are not a species to be dismissed, she said, and that our weapons may be primitive, and our technology may be limited, but there is something inside us that cannot be measured or calculated or predicted. She holstered both revolvers and stood up. My grandmother killed a man with this gun when she was 16 years old, she said, and he was bigger than her and stronger than her, and he had every advantage that mattered on paper. What happened? Chun asked. He broke into her family's farm in the middle of the night, Maya said, and he thought he was going to take whatever he wanted because he was a grown man and she was just a girl and the math was on his side. She paused and looked down at the weapon on her hip. She shot him 6 times in the dark from 30 feet away. Maya continued, and she did not miss once, and when her father came running, he found her standing over the body with an empty gun and shaking hands and tears on her face. Chun was quiet for a long moment. How did she do it? He finally asked. Because she had to, Maya said, and because there was no other option, and because somewhere inside her was a voice that said she was not going to die that night, no matter what. She looked around the chamber at all the alien delegates who were still arguing and analyzing and trying to make sense of what they had seen. That is what humans are, she said, and that is what the Coalition does not understand, and that is what their models will never be able to capture. A commotion near the main entrance drew their attention, and Maya saw Commander Zethral pushing through the crowd with all 4 of his arms waving to get people out of his way. He reached them and stopped, and for a moment, he just stared at Maya with an expression that was difficult to read on his alien features. I have studied warfare for 200 years, he said finally, and I have analyzed 11,000 recorded engagements across 47 species, and in all that time I have never seen anything like what you did today. I know, Maya said. I do not understand it, Zethral continued, and my models cannot explain it, and my algorithms cannot predict it, and everything I thought I knew about combat has been proven wrong. I know that too. The Veloxy commander made a sound that might have been frustration or might have been something else. Will you explain it to me? He asked. And will you help me understand how a single human with 2 primitive weapons could defeat a Kreth-Axe warrior in less than 4 seconds? Maya considered his request, and she saw something in his eyes that looked almost like humility. And that was something she had not expected from a species that had been studying war for 12,000 years. Yes, she said, I will explain it to you, but not here and not surrounded by all these people who are more interested in being angry than in learning. Zethral nodded and gestured toward a door at the far end of the chamber. There is a private observation lounge, he said, and we can talk there without interruption. Maya looked at Ambassador Chen, who shrugged and spread his hands. I think the damage to diplomatic relations has already been done, he said with a weak smile, so you might as well complete the education. Maya followed Commander Zeth through the crowd, and she could feel hundreds of eyes on her back as she walked, and she knew that whatever happened next would determine whether humanity would be welcomed into the Coalition or feared. By it, she hoped it would be both. The observation lounge overlooked the main floor of the symposium hall, and through the wide windows, Maya could see cleanup crews repairing The damage from Chervek's uncontrolled bioelectric. Discharge Commander Zithral stood beside her, and his forearms were clasped behind his back in what seemed to be a posture of deep thought, and his eyes were fixed on the spot where the fight had taken place. I have run the analysis 17 times, he said finally, and each time the result is the same, and each time my systems tell me that what happened should not have been possible. Maya watched the crew's work, and she did not respond immediately. Your weapons are 200 years old, Zethral continued, and they have no targeting computers and no predictive systems and no enhancement of any kind. Just iron sights and practice, Maya said. And yet you hit 12 shots in less than 4 seconds, Zethral said. And every shot found a critical weak point in Krethak's anatomy, which you have never studied and should not have known. Maya turned to face him, and she leaned against the window with her arms crossed. I did not know where to shoot, she admitted. And I did not have any information about Krethak's biology before today. Zethral's forearms spread wide in a gesture of confusion. Then how? He demanded. And how did you know where to aim, and how did you hit targets you could not have known existed? I did not aim at targets, Maya said. I aimed at joints and at glowing things and at anything that looked like it might be important. That is not a combat strategy. No, Maya agreed. It is instinct. Zethral made a frustrated sound, and he began pacing back and forth across the lounge with his multiple legs clicking on the floor. Instinct is not a factor in combat analysis, he said. And it cannot be measured or quantified or included in predictive models. I know, Maya said. And that is exactly why your models will never be able to predict what humans will do. She pushed off from the window and walked to the center of the room where Zethral had stopped his pacing. Let me ask you something, she said. And how long has the coalition been at peace? Zethral thought for a moment before answering. 3,217 standard years, he said. Since the last major conflict ended with the Treaty of Velos Prime. And in all that time, Maya continued, how have your species been studying warfare? Through simulation and analysis and historical review, Zethral said. And we have developed the most sophisticated combat prediction systems in the galaxy. You study war like it is history, Maya said. And you treat it like it is a problem that has already been solved. And you approach it like scientists studying a dead thing under glass. Zethral started to protest, but Maya held up her hand. Humans have been killing each other since we first learned to pick up rocks, she said. And we have never stopped, and every generation finds new ways to destroy and new reasons to fight. She began walking slowly around the room, and Zethral's eyes followed her movement. My grandmother's grandmother fought in a war, Maya said. And my grandmother's mother fought in a different war, and my grandmother fought when she was a teenager against a man who wanted to hurt her family. She stopped and turned to face him directly. My mother served in 2 conflicts, she continued. And my father died in a 3rd, and I have been in more firefights than I can count since I joined the service at 18. Zethral was silent, and something in his posture had changed as if he was finally beginning to understand. You have had 3,000 years of peace, Maya said. And we have never had more than a few decades without someone somewhere deciding that violence was the answer to their problems. That sounds exhausting, Zethral said quietly. It is, Maya agreed. And it is horrible, and it is tragic, and it is everything that your coalition has worked so hard to avoid. She took a step closer to him. But it also means that we are very, very good at it, she said. And every human alive today is descended from people who survived, and from people who refused to give up, and from people who found ways to win against creatures that should have killed them. Zethral's forearms had dropped to his sides, and he was looking at her with an expression that might have been respect or might have been fear. We spent 100,000 years being prey, Maya said, and we were hunted by things with bigger claws and sharper teeth and faster legs, and we could not outrun them and we could not overpower them. How did your species survive? Zethral asked. We got clever, Maya said. And we got mean and we got desperate, and we learned that the creature who fights to survive will always beat the creature who fights to win. She reached down and touched the grip of her grandmother's revolver. Because survival does not have rules, she said. And survival does not follow patterns, and survival does not care about optimal engagement distances or predictive algorithms. Zethral was quiet for a long moment, and the sound of the cleanup. Crews working below was the only noise in the room. The coalition will vote on human integration tomorrow. He said, finally, I know. I had planned to recommend against it, he continued. Because all of my analysis showed that humans had nothing to offer. Maya waited. I will be changing my recommendation. Zethral said. And I will be telling the council that humans should be given full military integration immediately. Why? Maya asked. Not because you are powerful, he said. And not because your weapons are advanced, and not because your technology is impressive. He turned to look out the window at the damaged floor below. Because you are unpredictable, he said. And because the enemies we face at the edge of the galaxy expect logic and expect optimization and expect the same combat patterns that every other species uses. He turned back to face her. They do not expect crazy apes with ancient weapons who refuse to follow the rules. He said. Maya laughed, and it was a genuine sound that seemed to surprise them both. Commander, she said. I think that might be the nicest thing anyone has ever said about my species. The vote the next day was unanimous, and humanity was granted full military integration into the Galactic Coalition Defense Force. The official documentation called it a tactical reassessment of unoptimized combat methodologies, and it was full of complex language about the value of unpredictability. In combat scenarios, Maya just called it respect, and somewhere in the back of her mind she could almost hear her grandmother laughing, and she could almost feel her grandfather's hand on her shoulder, and she knew that they would have been proud. Humanity had finally been recognized, not for what they had, but for what they were. Survivors, and the galaxy would never look at them the same way again.